Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
So this is the first time I've actually thought that I was in an alternate universe where I was like, this guest has such completely different experiences than I do. I'm just not sure we're on the same plane.
Well, I think her story was a little bit, that's true. But yeah, even so, oddly enough, we were all in the same city while we were recording it.
Yes, I know. Anyway, we had a really, really good conversation and just a lot of fun, which is what I really love about doing these things, is meeting new people and talking about really interesting topics, but making them tangible and real world. So who is on the show today that's got me so happy?
Yes, so today, Alice Sheldon in her book, Why Aren't We Teaching This at School? Which talks a lot about needs. And before I go into detail, because we talked quite into detail about that, what were your takeaways?
So she does talk about her own kind of hierarchy of needs, and it was interesting. You had some nice research that complemented what she had been doing and gave her some new research as well with Baines and their own kind of pyramid of needs. But I like the discussion that we had of separating what is a need versus what is a want, and really getting to grips with what are those things that are common needs and trying to find a common ground between different groups. And that kind of led on to the other big takeaway, which was I asked the question about how are you able to communicate across tribes? Because tribalism is so rife these days, globally, geopolitically, whatever it happens to be. And she was like giving a really nice personal story where she needed to expand her empathy beyond her comfort zone to be able to listen and empathize with someone else and actually practicing what she preached. And I think that's a really, really good thing to do, is to expand your empathy and kind of get out of your comfort zone to bridge the gap. But what were your thoughts? Or looks like you've got a thought now.
Yeah, because I was listening to you and we talked about listening a lot, and I think you just picked my insights.
Oh,
Now I'm sitting here like a battle rapper and going like, oh my god, he just took my arguments away. What am I
so
talking
so
about?
you edit that out, because you're right. I did just exactly
No,
that
no, no,
thing.
no, no, no. I'll go with this because I believe I'm good at it. Let's see if that's true. So what I liked is because we also asked about right and wrong, and when you listen or when you try to explore problems, that is a thing that isn't helping as you described. And we talked a bit about a personal story, and there was something around racism and labeling things as wrong stops a conversation and disconnects from it rather than actually investigates it. And I found it as well interesting because it also relates to a lot of sort of customer research, iterative process, and solutioning, where you go, well, actually, these days, for a lot of the things organizations are doing, there is no right or wrong solution anymore. Nothing's perfectly wrong and nothing's perfectly right either, which is not a bad thing. I think it's quite nice and positive that there's a lot of space in between you can explore. And there's a place for everyone on that list, right? Rather than, oh, I'm the only one right and everyone else forget about it. Or if there's 3 people and they're all right, then either of the solutions are probably worth the same, which I think is not what we should be doing these days. So not having a right or wrong opens up a lot of more detail and insight, getting closer to a problem, than realizing, no, there isn't such a thing, What's right for you is not necessarily right for me. So we need different things. And they're going to be both beneficial for me and the other one for you. So not taking right and wrong out of the equation, I found very important, very interesting, and it was good to hear her view on that. So that's my big takeaway there.
Well, I'd love to hear you say more about that, but why don't we ask Alice to say more about that?
Before the interview, a quick word from our very first sponsor, Zencaster. We use Zencaster for all our audio and video recording, and it's a very nifty tool that splits up all the channels for very easy editing. Zencaster is used by 10% of all active podcasts. You can get 40% off the first 3 months and unlimited audio and video recordings with our special coupon code wickedpodcast. I repeat, Wicked Podcast for 40% off. And now, the interview. Hello, everyone. Today we're here with Alice Sheldon. Hello, Alice. Welcome and nice to meet you.
Thank you. It's an absolute delight to be here.
So, as usual, we start at the top. So, please tell our listeners who you are and why you wrote the book.
Sure. So, my name is Alice Sheldon, and I go into groups and organisations of all different kinds to introduce the ideas that are in my book, which are basically about personal happiness and then into how to be really effective in your organisation and achieve what you want to in the world. And the reason I wrote the book is because I came across the body of stuff that is in it and that I've distilled, if you like, over a number of years. And it's called Why Weren't We Taught This at School for a reason, because I think it's a volume of stuff that is useful to many people, and a lot of people haven't come across it. So that was the purpose behind it, really, just to make it available to people who might want to make use of it.
So, sorry, the expression "volume of stuff." Can you tell? Can you just tell us a bit more about the volume of stuff?
I'd
Maybe
love to
some
tell you about the
overworked
volume of
comment?
stuff without any of your listeners being put off by the idea that there's a volume of it. Because one of the things that I love about it is it's quite simple, and then you can apply it in lots of different ways. So the central principle, thank you, Troy. The central principle is it's called needs understanding, and it turns out that if we look at the world through the lens of our shared human needs, so those are obviously our kind of survival needs, but more interestingly, needs like, do I belong? Do I matter? How can I be creative here? What's the purpose that I have? All these needs. When we start to look at our behaviour and other people's behaviour through that lens, then lots of things can happen, both in terms of how we relate to one another and also in terms of how we solve problems at work and in the wider world. Was that better than volume of stuff?
Yes, that was a vast improvement.
Okay, good.
So let's talk a little bit more about the list of needs, because interestingly, there is a company called Bain Consulting who brought a sort of a pyramid of needs, which it reminded me of somewhat, because there's certain groups, they have certain layers that come from very basic ones to very more, I don't want to say esoterical ones, but more kind of, self-realization and these kind of things, levels, all the way coming from, food and that. So it feels somewhat the same, but it's obviously different. Can you talk a bit more about sort of the groups of needs that people have?
Yeah, I mean, I love this, Marcus, because I hadn't come across this company and the needs layout that they had. So I had a little look into them, and they are building on the sort of classic Maslow hierarchy of needs, which also underlies, many years back, the work that I have trained in and then built upon. And it is interesting how people want to or don't want to class needs. The way that I tend to think about needs is not as any kind of hierarchy. I do tend to think about it that certain needs will be more around in particular situations, and certain needs will be more around for particular people. So a needs list, just for people to have an idea of, would sort of fit very comfortably onto a side of A4. So it's not like a list of 10 words, it's a list of quite a lot of words. And actually, when people see a needs list initially, it can be a bit frightening because there are quite a lot of them. And what I find is very easy, very early on, is for people to start to get a sense of which needs are really important to them. And often, of course, that has to do with their history in the world. And similarly, within any kind of organizational setting, if you're looking at a meeting, for example, you might be looking at the same small handful of needs, no matter what meeting you were going into. So both situationally and individually, you get a kind of sense of a handful that you can work with, and that makes it less intimidating, I think.
So this word needs, I can be real pedantic sometimes about language, sometimes about self-speak, how I use my own language. And occasionally I pull other people up on it. And they say, well, what I really need is I need a raise. Or what I really need is, to start dating this person. Or what I really need is, let's back up. I need food, I need shelter, I need water, I need love. Most everything else is a want. And when I change that from a need word to a want word, I take the energy out of it and I give my brain more space to kind of think about, ways of solving my wants versus surviving on my needs. So when you talk about your needs list, where does it fall kind of on that spectrum of what you really want versus the urgency of need?
I love that. I love that. I love that question, Troy. And need is such a loaded word in English, anyway, isn't it? It has a whole, a whole thing with it. So it's interesting as well when we start to look at other languages and how it translates. But just reeling back to the English for a minute, the way that I use need is to refer to anything which all human beings require in order to be able to thrive as well as to survive. So it's fuzzy. It might not pass your completely watertight definition. And indeed, we can have interesting trainer conversations over lunch about whether something is a need or whether it's just a very strong want. But I really like the split between want and need. It becomes extremely important. And as you say, I love that description that you give about there being more spaciousness around a want. So in the work that I do, I would always be encouraging people to hold on really tight to those needs, those things that help us to thrive, and then try to be as unattached as possible to how we're going to get those things. It's not easy, but it is the route, I think, to a happier and more fulfilled way of being, and a more successful way of working as well.
So, and one point you also talk about there in relation to it is sort of the idea of, or the act of listening, both probably listening to others and yourself to understand your own needs and the needs of others. So tell us a bit about, because you give some examples of, listening where you're not really listening, sort of the things that appear to be listening. There's a list there as well. Can you give us some examples there of what you mean by that, the kind of right way or the wrong way of listening?
And it's so great when you ask that question, Marcus, because immediately my head is like, oh, am I listening properly to Marcus at the moment? Or am I actually just thinking about what next I'm going to say, or what, So in situations where, where we can all do it so easily. But I enjoy having, a formulation of 10 ways of listening that can be really unhelpful when we're trying to build connection with people. So to give a few examples, one of the situations I use in the book is someone who's going to give a presentation and is sharing with a colleague that they feel scared about giving the presentation. They're anxious about giving the presentation. And I go through 10 of the responses that can be unhelpful. But just to give a flavour, the ones that crop up particularly often. So one would be the advising response, the solution finding response. So we go straight from problem to solution. So, you need to hire a coach to help you with this, or have you thought about, talking to so-and-so who did a talk last month, or whatever it is. A second thing that we can do is we can fact find, and we often think that this is active listening. So this is when we start to quiz the person about what they're telling us. So, oh, tell me about, the last talk you gave. Why do you think you're afraid? When did you last do this? So what we're doing there is we're kind of hijacking the conversation onto our territory rather than really allowing and supporting the person to explore what might be more helpful for them. A third example is when we start to, story tell. So, oh, when I gave a talk, blah, 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 blah. And what's common with all of those ways of responding is that they are all incredibly well-intentioned. So in all cases, we are looking to support our colleague with their dilemma, but what we're doing actually probably isn't helpful. And the other thing to notice is it might be helpful later on. So, for example, advising can be extremely useful. If I've got some experience that I can share with you, that can be very helpful at the right time. The key thing is that when someone is feeling emotional or upset about something, they would need to be heard first before they're open to hearing our suggestions. And once they've relaxed and feel like, oh, this person's got what is really worrying me, they become open both to solving their own problem and being open to other suggestions or indeed, stories or whatever it is.
Hmm. So
So
what I'm sorry, Troy. So what I'm quite curious about in this one, just to dig maybe a little bit deeper or move it into maybe my area that I'm more comfortable with,
Yeah, yeah.
is essentially, so the listening is interesting, and I think that comes home with my background as well in sort of customer research and human-centered research, where you try to listen to people and you normally start with trying to find out what the problem even is, or if you have an assumption of a problem, finding out if that assumption is true or false or different. And I just found it, because just working in a project where I could see the listening there to the customer in this sense was a bit like one of your examples, where it wasn't even really asking the customer, tell me how you feel about that, or tell me what happens then, kind of further exploring the context of what the maybe perceived problem was, but quickly going, oh, look, we got this, or look, we got that. What do you think about that? Which doesn't get you very far, because you're stuck in one level, and you actually don't get closer to the problem. You just bring solutions to the table and ask if they'd like one. Does your work sometimes go into this area with maybe even particular teams potentially, to not just within the team and as people listening, but sort of listening to customers and others around as a target?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of my work, in the past has been with parents and schools. So I'm just moving into more organizational and business environments. But this absolutely. And we know, as don't we, as consumers, if you're on the end and you're trying to convey that you've got a problem, actually, if someone cuts in too early with that solution, it's like a close down or a sort of not being met. So exactly, Marcus, as you describe it, I yeah, it is exactly how you uh, I'm really losing my words, but exactly as you talk about your area of work, I couldn't say it better.
Yeah.
That experience is, I share that absolutely, and there is a lot. I think the other thing is that people, and we touched on this a little bit pre-recording, but I think people have this idea that if we are going to really hear the other person, it might take a lot more time. It might take a lot more kind of effort of understanding to sort of meet the other person. It is a little bit different if you're doing one-off customer service calls, although even then, to be honest, in terms of reducing the number of complaints that come in because the person feels like they've really been met, I would argue it's usually the most helpful way to go. But certainly if you're in ongoing relationships, I would say, it is worth every second that one invests to really get behind a problem, rather than just trying to put plasters on it, or it both relationally that's damaging, and also in terms of the business hours that you need to put in, it doesn't make any sense at all.
so Marcus and I have been friends for a number of years. And we kind of started really kind of building our relationship after work drinks. And we decided that we were going to do this thing where every time we got together, we were going to come up with one new idea. And then we take a picture of the two of us with that one idea written on a post it note. And one of those post it notes just said, say more about that. Because that was the way that we decided was the way to open the conversation and just say, okay, we're going to pull on the thread. We're not going to try to advise. We're not going to try to shut down. We're not going to try to storytell. Just say more about that. Like, give them more space to say things. And I use that so much. Like, oh, that's interesting. Say more about that. I'm open to hearing. And the other thing that I learned over many years is I'll let you tell me as many stories and talk as long as you like. But until you say, what should I do? I don't offer advice, because that for me is the cue that you were talking about, which is when they're open to an idea, when they're open to a coaching, when they're open to a suggestion, they'll ask for it. And until then, they just want to talk. And sometimes that's what they need. So that's interesting for me. Um, I've got a different question. I'm going to move to a different part of a thought. You were saying the 10 things don't to do. It's a little like saying, please don't think of a pink elephant, because then you're suddenly focusing on the 10 pink elephants that you shouldn't do when you're listening. What are some proactive things that people should do if you can come up with just 2 or 3 positives?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, Troy, especially after the piece that you've just brought, because actually written in the book, I think I haven't quite put it in the same words as you have, but that prompt, would you like to say more about that, or what more do you have to tell me? Is sitting firmly on a page somewhere. So I now dedicate that sentence to you. But yeah, there's essentially the I love that question. I think the purpose of having those things not to do is they're like an alarm bell. So they wake us up.
Mm.
And what's really dangerous, and what I always want to say to people very quickly, is these are not things to beat ourselves over the head with. I mean, I do all of them. I've been doing this stuff for years and I still do all of them at times. So anyway, that's that piece. In terms of what to do, the first one actually is keep your mouth shut. There's a great phrase I'm absolutely sure you'll have come across before. Don't just do something, sit there. So I love that, because it really is just an invitation to keep your mouth shut. Now, I have problems with this. It may surprise you to hear, but actually that being able to just receive and listen, and not jump in with our stuff before we sort of thought about it. Then I go on to talk about prompts. So that's an example. That's where this, would you like to tell me more? How can I help you is another of my favorites. That's really helpful with kids often. How can I help you? What would you like me to do? And that can help sometimes break the pattern of just getting stuck in a hamster wheel. So there are sort of prompts, and then there are other pieces as well, that come on. But perhaps that just gives a flavour of a couple of examples of things to do.
Yeah. And if I take that to maybe an extreme, or just to play with devil's advocate, then, and again, just to reflect a bit on some of the things I come across in organizations where, especially, so there's this odd paradox where a lot of organizations try to find out more about particular customers, or try to improve how team dynamics work to the benefit of productivity, effectiveness, all of this. It's then nearly in the same breath, often said, yeah, but we're not just sit there and talk, or we're not just sit there and do research. We have to produce something. And as you said, the solutionizing is ripe there. How do you balance this then to say, right, there is a listening aspect, and eventually you will have to get into actions in terms of maybe time spent or something? What sort of, is there such a thing as a good balance or not? And
Yeah.
when would you shift things over then? Or
Yeah, I love that. Again, I mean, this could be a whole question. One thing I think is that often, what if we think about, for example, how meetings are run, often they are not run consensually. So, in other words, the people sitting around the table are not, they're there because they've been told to be there, because it's a staff meeting on a Wednesday morning or whatever it is. You can switch quite a lot already simply by creating a shared purpose. So I'm here facilitating this meeting today, and my understanding is that what we're trying to do is this. Does anyone have anything to add or subtract, or whatever? So you can set conversations up already so that people have more buy-in, and then they're less likely to be talking about other things that aren't on purpose, because they've got a part in that purpose. There are times, I think, where someone is so caught up in something that there is a danger that the whole action or purpose or forward direction can be derailed, and at that point it is important, I think, and it is a piece of leadership to be able to say, what I'm noticing is that we've spent this amount of time on this, and I'm concerned that if we don't shift over now, we're going to lose what we're looking for as a whole. So there's something about making it very conscious when you choose to when you choose to stop listening before perhaps the person in question is ready to move on. And you might then want to just pick that up quietly later, with that person, say, I just want to check when I did that in that meeting, how was that? And so that you maintain the relationship. But absolutely, I think there is it's not a question that we all just sort of sit there and listen to each other all day long and don't get anything done. That doesn't serve the needs of the whole, or indeed of the individuals, most of them.
Go ahead, Marcus.
I just wanted to bring up, when we talk about meetings and teams or people discussing about what to do, and seemingly even in one of the best, clearest purposes of why you would talk about the things, you can sometimes fail. And I think so I wanted to ask about, I think somewhere you give an example of, a group of people trying to decide which restaurant to go to. It's like, where should we go? What do we want? We have one example, I think, in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that and the dilemma or the example you're raising there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, it's such a small example, isn't it? Which restaurant do we go to? But I just thought it neatly sort of encapsulates some of the key ideas. So basically, there's an argument going on between two women about which restaurant to go to, and so there's there's energy being expended on this dialogue and dancing around, trying to get to what restaurant they're going to end up at. If we just reel that back a little bit, in the book, I think we give one of them some understanding of this way of viewing the world. And when she looks through that lens, then she's got a very clear sense that for her, it's something quite old in her life, probably, about does she matter? So when her friend is trying to make the suggestion about where to go, she's feeling like, hold on, where's my stuff? Do I matter? Do I have a voice? I'm not being heard. And so that's going to trigger her. And so her reaction is going to be, I don't want to go to your restaurant. I want to go to my restaurant. It's nothing to do with the restaurant, of course. It's what's going on underneath. And she, I think, is, knowing this friend well, it's easy for her to see that perhaps what's going on for the friend may be something around fun, something around respect. She's seen these patterns playing out before. And so then the question is, well, what do you do with that? And actually, one of the things I wanted to demonstrate in the book is that you don't need loads of people to have this way of understanding in order for it to be able to make a difference. Just with one of them being able to say something, it can shift the situation. And so it doesn't need to even name needs. It can just be like, it looks like we're getting really stuck here. Do you have any ideas what we could do that could work for both of us? And just that kind of formulation names, we've got a problem, so let's name that. And we're trying to find a solution. I want to find a solution that holds both of us with care. And there are lots of, sort of different ways that one can say that or do that. But that's the basic idea. How do we put these needs in the pot so that we stop wasting energy on conflicting strategies and get a mutual strategy that works for us both?
Well,
does that answer the question, Marcus?
Yes, it did, very much so. And it's a great one because I think everyone can relate to that one, because I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but I just having a bit of a Twilight Zone moment. You must live in a completely different universe than I live in, like altogether. Like almost zero of the meetings that I attend ever have any purpose or objective whatsoever. So there's no idea when we're drifting away from the purpose. And when I go out to dinner with my friends, nobody wants to make a decision. We will wander around Soho for hours. I would love it if two of my friends were having a fight to decide which of two restaurants to actually go to. So I'm not sure about your universe and my universe, but they're not 100% connected.
That's great, Troy.
But moving back to the topic, I'm going to bring up a lightning rod word. I'm going to bring up tribalism. And that sense of belonging and belonging to one tribe versus belonging to another tribe. How do you do what you're talking about in your book, cross tribes?
This is so fantastic, a question. And I'll reveal a piece of personal history, which is that last year I was dating someone, and they had a different cultural background from me. They weren't from the UK. They were from a different English-speaking country I won't name. But that what became clear after 2 dates was that this guy had extremely right-wing views on matters of race, on matters of gender. I found it shocking. I actually felt sick because it was so different from my perspective on the world. And I did actually, not through any good thinking, but simply because I couldn't cope with the sort of physical stuff that was coming up for me, I just ended that call quite quickly and left it. And I reflected a lot. And I thought, you know what? I need to put my money where my mouth is, because what I want to do is just not have anything to do with this man again. But actually, that is just going to leave him in the same place as before. And what I need to do is engage. And so
And
what I
might leave you in the same place that you were in before as well.
Exactly. So my sphere of safety stays at a particular level. And that's what, so you're absolutely right, Troy. Can I expand my safety bit to engage with this man, even if I do not share his values or beliefs, and I do not want to share his values or beliefs at any level? But how can I go towards understanding him? And so I did then, through a series, I didn't have any more calls with him, but through a series of texts and messages, I worked quite hard to really try to understand where he was coming from, and also to propose that we at some point met to hear each other. What came out of that was first of all, he said, I'm really, he said, it's the first time someone with different views hasn't just written me off as a racist and has tried to understand me. The second thing that happened was we entered another lockdown and I didn't meet him, and actually I haven't gone back since and gone to it, and I don't know whether I will or not. But I think that what I did there was I really chose to empathise before I brought my pieces. It wasn't that I wasn't going to bring my pieces at all, or that I might not in the future. I haven't yet, but it did feel really important to do that. And for me, that was just a tiny piece of what you're talking about. But I think the reason it was important to me is because I think as individuals we so often feel powerless in the face of this global tribalism, and I really would love to challenge each of us to look at our own backyard. Where is it that we don't grow because it's too scary, or don't challenge because of what might happen, and where is the zone of out of comfort but doable, and where is the zone of actually that's completely beyond me. So yeah, that's
And it's brilliant to understand. Once you understand that it actually both helps you as much as you might want to just impose or figure out the other person, you're actually figuring out yourself quite a bit. And I found that often as well. That when someone, I found it often that when someone tells me something about myself that they might disagree with or see in a particular way, to see that they're actually not necessarily talking about me, but they're talking about themselves and the way they look at things. So often people, let's say for example, it's a bad one because I can't find one out of real life at the moment. But if someone's impatient, and then actually you see someone else is either they see someone else as impatient or just not fast enough, right? And then you realize actually they see the world through that lens of being impatient, and therefore they just project these things. And it's fascinating always to see that there's dynamic in both directions. So, but
Hold on,
quickly
Marcus.
leading up,
Hold on.
what?
What is it about you that I don't like about me is the phrase that I've used myself to describe that exact same thing.
All right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think there's a lot of really. It gets really interesting when you have these things of a double dynamic and realize it's just not one way. And I think that should, in theory, appeal to people more and understand that there's more in it. But before I go to the next one, it's as usual we have more questions than time. So here's the last one that doesn't quite line up with a matter of racism, to say, right and wrong. Often we have conversations where there is no such thing as a right or wrong, or listening and information, right? And so I don't want to tie racism up with that, because I feel racism generally is wrong. So the question maybe is exactly that. So besides of that, there are often areas and contexts where there is no real right or wrong. The listening answers. What's sort of your view on these kind of assessments, and how realistic they are, and how they help or how they not help in conversations and listening?
Mm. Have you prepared like all these questions to require 3 days of discussion, like to be packed into 3 minutes?
No, that has just come out of
checking.
mainly my own perception of, like, I like to ramble on,
Yeah.
so I'll pick the stuff
That's great.
that helps
I
me
love it,
ramble on.
Marcus. to challenge your podcast guests to keep it, yeah. No, I mean, again, seriously, it's such a great question, because it gets to the heart of things for me. I suppose, first of all, in terms of how I would reframe right or wrong, I would reframe it as something which is, deeply meeting my needs or not. And that would go even as far as racism, or something that I find, both abhorrent, and that I know I need to unpick subconscious bits of myself. But what I would say there is, it really is not in line with my values and with what helps me to thrive, this way of behaving or this way of doing things. So that's how I would think of right or wrong. Or conversely, I love when we all meet together in community and do this, that, or the other, because that gives me so much. I think when we start framing, labeling things as right and wrong, or good and bad, or it polarizes us again, and it gets us into difficulty, because someone who is labeled as being bad, or being wrong, is just going to cut off. It's disconnecting. What I want to say is, I profoundly detest what you're doing or what you've done, and I am really believing that there is a reason for you that is life-giving in doing that somewhere. That's, and I wouldn't be saying this, but in my head, it's likely that that's all got really twisted up in some way. If we can untwist that and give you what you're really looking for by this horrific behavior, that's the way to solving things. It solves nothing to, I'm the good guy, you're the bad guy. I don't think that shifts anything.
And that's a great way to, I think, wrap up the session, and a great insight. So, Alice, thank you so much. It was a great conversation, and thank you for spending some time with us today.
And thank you so much, both of you, for having me. It's been such a pleasure to meet you.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section, and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.